Massey Ferguson red was the colour of British farming, on every tractor in every farmyard, the machine a generation learned to drive on and the one still working in a Kenyan field 40 years later. At its peak, Banner Lane in Coventry employed 8,000 workers in the largest tractor factory in the Western Hemisphere, exporting to 140 countries. They survived a wartime birth-building aero engines, survived a $2 billion debt crisis that nearly destroyed the company, survived 3 changes of ownership and kept building through everything the century threw at them. And then, after 56 years of making, the factory went silent. Christmas Eve, 2002. How does a factory that survived all of that simply disappear? What really happened at Banner Lane? Chapter 1. The Farmer's Son Who Flew. The story begins, as so many stories of British engineering do, with someone who didn't fit. Henry George Ferguson, Harry to everyone who knew him, was born on the 4th of November, 1884, at Growell, a townland near Dromore in County Down. He was the 4th of 11 children. His father, James Fisher Ferguson, was a Plymouth Brethren farmer, devout, exacting, a man who measured the world in straight furrows and scripture. His mother was Mary Bell. The family worked the land the way Ulster families had worked the land for generations, by hand, by horse, by the bruising physical labour that small farms demanded of every child old enough to carry a pail. Harry was small, not just young small. He would remain physically slight his entire life, a compact, wiry figure who lacked the build for the hauling and heaving that defined a farmer's working day. He hated the drudgery. Not farming itself, he understood the land, and he'd carry a farmer's instincts to his grave, but the sheer grinding, animal effort of it. The heavy ploughs, the stubborn horses, the back-breaking monotony of work that hadn't fundamentally changed since the Middle Ages. He left school at 14, worked the family farm for another 4 years, and in 1902, at 18, he did what restless, clever young men in Ulster did when the land couldn't hold them. He went to Belfast. His elder brother Joseph Bell Ferguson, Joe, ran a bicycle and motorcar repair shop at J.B. Ferguson and Cummins on the Shankill Road. Joe was the practical one. Steady hands, good business sense, the kind of man who could strip a combustion engine and have it running by tea time. Harry joined him, and for the next 7 years, the two brothers worked side by side, fixing engines by day and Harry attending evening classes at Belfast Technical College by night. It was in that cramped Shankill Road workshop, elbow deep in cylinder heads and carburettors, that the small, fierce, perfectionist personality that would later terrify Detroit lawyers and Coventry shop stewards began to take shape. Those evening classes mattered. Ferguson studied engineering with the intensity of a man who knew he'd missed a formal education and intended to make up for it by force of will. He could draw, calculate, and argue a mechanical point with anyone, but it was the temperament, not the technical knowledge, that set him apart. He was meticulous to the point of obsession. He could not tolerate shoddy work, imprecise thinking, or people who settled for good enough when better was achievable. He was teetotal. The Plymouth Brethren upbringing never quite left him, and almost violently self-disciplined. He kept his own counsel. He trusted his own judgment, and when he believed he was right about something, which was most of the time, he would pursue it with a single-mindedness that people around him found either inspiring or exhausting, depending on how long they'd been exposed to it. The first obsession wasn't tractors, it was flight. In 1909, Harry visited air shows at Blackpool and Rheims. He saw what a powered machine could do when it left the ground, and something caught fire in him. He came back to Belfast and convinced Joe to help him build a monoplane, a fragile contraption of wood, wire and fabric, fitted with an 8-cylinder Japy engine. On the 31st of December 1909, in a field near Hillsborough, County Down, Harry Ferguson became the first person in Ireland, and the first Irishman anywhere, to fly an aeroplane of his own design. It wasn't much of a flight. A few hundred yards, a few feet off the frozen ground, the JAP engine screaming at full throttle. But it was enough. The brothers, however, parted over it. Joe thought aviation was a death sentence waiting to happen. Harry thought it was the future. They fell out. Harry, characteristically, went his own way. In 1911, he founded the May Street Motor Company in Belfast, selling Maxwell, Star, Darracq and Vauxhall cars alongside the American Overtime tractor. He renamed it Harry Ferguson Limited the following year. In 1912, He drove a Vauxhall in the French Grand Prix, alongside A.J. Hancock and W. Watson, a detail that reveals the breadth of Ferguson's mechanical appetite. He wasn't a specialist. He was a man who wanted to understand everything that moved. He married Maureen Watson in 1913, the daughter of a Dromore grocer. Both families boycotted the wedding. The Fergusons were Plymouth brethren. The Watsons were not. Harry, characteristically, married her anyway. Then the war came, and the war changed everything. In 1917, the Irish Department of Agriculture asked Ferguson to take charge of the operation and maintenance of all tractors and farm implements in Ireland under the Grow More Food campaign. It was a wartime emergency. Food production had to increase, and the horses were being shipped to France to haul artillery and supply wagons through Flanders mud. Tractors were the replacement, and someone had to keep them running. Ferguson said yes. For the next 2 years, he travelled the length and breadth of Ireland, working with every tractor and plough the department could lay hands on. American Fordsons, International Harvester Titans, the occasional overtime. Machines of wildly varying quality sent to farmers who'd never operated anything more complicated than a horse-drawn seed drill. He fixed them when they broke. He taught farmers how to use them. He watched men struggle with implements that were never designed to work together as a system, bolted and chained to tractors that fought them at every turn. And he saw the accidents. What he witnessed appalled him. The contemporary American tractors, heavy, crude, brutally powerful, were designed on a simple principle: more weight, more grip, more muscle. They weighed 2 or 3 tons. They burned fuel like furnaces. And they killed people. When a trailing plough caught a buried root or a stone, the resistance didn't just stop the tractor, it tipped it. The front wheels lifted, the machine pivoted on its rear axle, and the whole thing flipped backwards onto the driver. Backflip accidents were so common they barely made the newspapers. Farmers accepted them the way miners accepted roof falls. It was just how it was. Ferguson couldn't accept it. He was, by every account, a man physically incapable of tolerating a bad solution to a problem he could see clearly. And he could see, with the clarity of an engineer who was also a farmer's son, that the problem was fundamental. The tractor and the implement were 2 separate things. The plough trailed behind, like a dead weight. All the soil's resistance fed backwards through the drawbar and tried to tip the tractor over. The heavier you made the tractor to stop the tipping, the more fuel it used, the more it compacted the soil, the more expensive it became. It was an engineering dead end. The solution, Ferguson decided, was to make the tractor and the implement a single mechanical unit, not trailing, coupled, rigidly attached in a way that turned the soil's resistance into useful downforce on the rear wheels. So the harder the plough worked, the harder the tractor gripped. A small machine could then outperform a heavy one because the work itself supplied the traction. It took years. Ferguson was not a man who rushed a solution. He was a man who worried a solution into existence, testing, discarding, rebuilding, refusing to release anything until it was right. He designed a plough that could be rigidly attached to a Model T Ford car, the Eros, which sold modestly against Henry Ford's own Fordson Model F. He met Charles E. Sorensen, Ford's production chief, in England in 1917, and through the early 1920s he demonstrated mechanical versions of his linkage on Fordsons at the Ford plant in Cork and at Dearborn in Michigan. Each demonstration got closer. Each iteration was better. But the engineering wasn't right yet. The attachment was rigid enough, but there was no automatic control, no way to keep the plough at a constant depth when the soil changed from soft to hard, from loam to clay, from clear ground to a field full of buried stones. Then, on the 12th of February 1925, working in Belfast with his longtime engineers Willie Sands and Archie Greer, Ferguson filed the patent that would change agriculture forever. He called it Apparatus for Coupling Agricultural Implements to Tractors and Automatically Regulating the Depth of Work. History would call it the Ferguson Master Patent, and what it described, the 3-point linkage with hydraulic draft control, was, in its quiet way, one of the most important mechanical inventions of the 20th century. Strip the engineering to its bones. 2 lower links and 1 upper top link attach the implement to the tractor in a triangle. The lower links carry the working forces. The top link senses the resistance the soil offers to the ploughshare. As the share digs deeper or hits harder ground, that resistance pushes forward and up through the top link into a hydraulic ram. which automatically lifts the implement just enough to keep depth constant. Automatic draft control. The machine thinks for itself, and because the implement is rigidly coupled rather than trailed, every kilogram of resistance the ground throws back at the plough is transmitted as downforce onto the tractor's rear wheels. A 1,200-kilogram tractor could now do work that previously needed a 3-ton machine because the work itself supplied the traction. Ferguson's small grey tractor effectively cheated physics. It was lighter, cheaper, safer, faster, and used less fuel than anything in its class, and it could not flip over backwards because the geometry of the linkage made backflip mechanically impossible. That was the genius. Not brute force, elegant force. A farmer's son's revenge on the machines that had brutalized his childhood. Chapter 2. The Black Tractor and the Handshake. Implementation took a decade. Ferguson was a perfectionist, and perfectionism in engineering means prototypes, arguments, and broken partnerships. He'd founded Ferguson Sherman Inc. at Evansville, Indiana, in 1925 with the Sherman brothers, Eber and George, to sell a duplex hitch plough for the Fordson. But the real prize was a complete tractor built around his system. In 1933, the first prototype appeared, the Ferguson Black, sometimes called the Irish Tractor, a dark, angular machine that looked nothing like the grey icons that would follow, but contained for the first time the complete Ferguson system in a working vehicle. A production partner was needed. Ferguson approached David Brown of Huddersfield, the gear-making firm, already well established in precision engineering, and in 1936, the Ferguson-Brown Company began producing the Ferguson Type A from Brown's works. It was a small, capable tractor with a 3-point linkage and hydraulic draft control. Type A No. 1 is now in the Science Museum in London, but only about 1,350 were ever made. The partnership soured almost immediately. Ferguson insisted on his own specification, down to the last bolt. Brown wanted modifications to suit British farmers' preferences. Ferguson wouldn't bend. He never bent. Always the best and only the best was his catchphrase, and it was both his greatest strength and the flaw that left a trail of wrecked partnerships behind him. By 1938, Ferguson was partnerless again, with a proven system and no factory, but he had something more valuable than a factory. He had a machine that could embarrass anything else in a ploughed field. The decisive meeting came in October 1938 on Henry Ford's Fairlane estate at Dearborn, Michigan. Ferguson shipped a Type A across the Atlantic and set it up against a pair of Ford's own engineers' best tractors. The demonstration took place in thick Fairlane mud, the kind of heavy, clinging ground that separated good tractors from bad ones in about 30 seconds. Ford's prototypes struggled. Ferguson's little machine, half the weight, cut through the ground as if it wasn't there, the 3-point linkage transferring every ounce of soil resistance into grip, the hydraulic draft control keeping the plough at a constant depth without the driver touching a lever. The watching Ford engineers fell silent. They knew what they were seeing. Old Henry was won over instantly. Ford was the son of Irish immigrants from County Cork. He'd grown up on a Michigan farm. He understood, in his bones, what Ferguson's system meant, not as an engineering abstraction, but as a liberation from the kind of backbreaking work both men had grown up hating. The two men agreed, by handshake, and no paperwork at all, that Ford Motor Company would manufacture a tractor built around the Ferguson system. Ferguson would design it and control worldwide sales. Ford would have the production muscle. Either could terminate at any time. No contract, no signatures. Two stubborn men who trusted each other's word. The Ford Ferguson 9N launched at Dearborn on the 29th of June 1939. It was a revelation. Light, affordable, safe, with the full 3-point linkage and hydraulic draft control that no other mass-produced tractor could match. According to Ford Motor Company production records cited by Tractor Data and the Ferguson Club Journal, 99,002 Ford 9Ns were built between 1939 and 1942. When wartime material restrictions forced a redesign, approximately 128,000 Ford 2Ns followed between 1942 and 1947. A combined total of about 227,000 Ford Ferguson tractors, fewer than the loosely quoted 300,000, sometimes repeated in popular histories, but more than enough to transform American farming. But the handshake deal that built them was about to be torn apart. Henry Ford died on the 7th of April 1947. His grandson, Henry Ford II, by then running the company, a very different man to the sentimental old farmer who'd shaken Ferguson's hand, made a calculation. Ferguson controlled worldwide sales and took a commission on every tractor. Ford built them and bore the manufacturing risk. Why? Henry Ford II asked his advisors, should Ford keep paying an outside Irishman to sell Ford's own product? The answer, of course, was that the outside Irishman owned the patents on the system that made the tractor work. But Henry Ford II didn't care. He was 29 years old, a Navy veteran who'd taken control of a company that was hemorrhaging money, and he had neither the sentimentality of his grandfather nor any particular interest in honouring a handshake he hadn't been part of. On the 30th of June 1947, Ford gave Ferguson notice that supplies of the 2N would end immediately. The same week, Ford announced a new tractor, the Ford 8N, to be distributed not by Ferguson, but by a new entity called Dearborn Motors Corporation, fronted by Ernest C. Kanzler. The 8N was, to a meaningful degree, a Ford Ferguson with Ferguson's hydraulic and three-point patents still embedded in it. A casual observer could barely tell the two machines apart. Ford had stolen his system, and Ferguson, the small, fierce, depressive perfectionist from County Down, did exactly what anyone who knew him would have predicted. He sued. The complaint filed in January 1948 in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York was, at the time, the largest civil action in American history. Ferguson alleged conspiracy under the Sherman and Clayton Acts, damages of $80 million, trebled to $240 million under Section 4 of the Clayton Act, plus a patent infringement claim of $3.7 million, also trebled. Total claimed $251.1 million. Ferguson's lawyers were Cahill, Gordon, Zachary and Raindell of New York. Ford's were Simpson, Thatcher and Bartlett, with Whitney North Seymour of counsel. Dearborn Motors was represented by Bruce Bromley of Cravath, Swain and Moore, three of the most expensive law firms in America, arrayed against a farmer's son from Dromore. The case consumed 4 years and about 10,000 pages of testimony. The antitrust portion was eventually dismissed. Ferguson's own American sales of $64.5 million in 1951 undermined the monopoly claim. But the patent infringement held. In April 1952, Ferguson and Ford settled out of court for $9.25 million, then the largest patent settlement in United States history. Ford conceded infringement of the hydraulic valve, coupling and power takeoff patents, and agreed to redesign the 8N to remove further infringement. After British tax, Ferguson kept about $5.6 million. It was a vindication, but a bitter one. He'd been right. He'd proven it, and it had cost him 4 years, his health, and whatever remained of his faith in handshake deals. Chapter 3. A war baby and a grey machine. But even before the lawsuit was filed, Ferguson had already found what he needed. Not vindication. A factory. Banner Lane was a war baby. In May 1939, with Britain rearming desperately against a threat that even Chamberlain's government could no longer pretend away, the Air Ministry needed a facility to build the Bristol Hercules, a massive, magnificent, ferociously complicated aero engine. 38.7 litres of displacement, 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, sleeve valves rather than poppet valves, a notoriously demanding manufacturing technology that required tolerances most British factories couldn't dream of hitting. The Hercules produced between 1,290 and 1,735 horsepower depending on the mark, and it would power the Wellington, the Halifax, the Stirling, the Beaufighter, and later the Hastings. Britain needed thousands of them, and it needed them built somewhere the Luftwaffe couldn't easily reach. Construction began later in 1939 on an 80-acre greenfield site at Tile Hill, just west of Coventry. The site was deliberate, far enough from the city centre to survive what everyone now expected was coming, but close enough to draw on Coventry's vast reservoir of engineering labour. The surrounding area carried Civil War-era names: Banner Lane, Cromwell Lane, Red Lane, because Cromwell was thought to have passed through on the way to Kenilworth Castle. Now, 3 centuries later, the lane that bore his name would host the largest single-roof factory most of those Coventry workers had ever seen. Over 1 million square feet of floor space, 93,000 square metres under one vast roof, spread across 80 acres of what had been Warwickshire farmland. The shadow factory concept was simple and brutal in its logic. Build precision manufacturing capacity at government expense, disperse it away from obvious bombing targets, contract its management to an established firm, and produce what the RAF needed as fast as humanly possible. Banner Lane was one of the largest of these shadow factories. The bill came to £1.7 million, a staggering figure when a small car cost 130. The Exchequer paid. The Exchequer had no choice. Operation was contracted to the Standard Motor Company under its formidable managing director, Captain Sir John Black. Standard was paid a management fee of £40,000 per annum to run the plant. Sir John was a particular kind of British industrialist, forceful, autocratic, a man who ran his factory the way a brigadier ran a brigade and expected similar obedience. Some components came from Rover's shadow factory at Acocks Green. The Hercules engine was a beast to manufacture. Those sleeve valves demanded machining tolerances that would have been ambitious in peacetime, let alone with a workforce expanding fast and raw materials rationed. But Black drove his people, and his people delivered. By the time Hercules production ended in 1945, more than 20,000 engines had come out of Banner Lane. 20,000 of the 14-cylinder radials that powered Bomber Command's Wellingtons over Germany and Coastal Command's Beaufighters over the Atlantic. The factory had been up and running before the Coventry Blitz of November 1940. Its dispersed Tile Hill location, roof camouflage, and high-quality concrete shelters helped it survive the night that destroyed so much of the city centre and killed over 500 people. Then the war ended, and Banner Lane, 1 million square feet of precision engineering capability, a workforce trained to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, a facility purpose-built to produce complex radial aero engines, was suddenly redundant. Across Britain, the shadow factories faced the same question. What now? Some were mothballed. Some were demolished. Some, the lucky ones, found a second life. Sir John Black needed work for his people. Harry Ferguson needed a British manufacturing partner because the Ford supply was about to be terminated and the American lawsuit would consume his attention for years. The two men met in 1945, two forceful, impatient personalities who recognized in each other the will to get things done and a profound impatience with anything that stood in the way. They agreed everything in principle within a couple of meetings. Standard would sign a 10-year lease for Banner Lane at £36,000 per annum and receive a fee for every tractor produced. Ferguson would handle design, development, sales, and service worldwide. It was a simpler deal than the Ford handshake, with clearer boundaries and written terms. And this time, it worked. The conversion of the factory from aero engines to tractors was itself a feat of industrial reinvention. The machine tools had to be reconfigured. The production lines had to be redesigned from scratch. A radial aero engine and a farm tractor share almost nothing in common except the basic principle that metal must be cut, shaped, and assembled with care. The workforce had to retrain. But these were people who had spent the war building 14-cylinder sleeve valve engines to aircraft-grade standards. A 4-cylinder tractor engine was, by comparison, beautifully straightforward. The skills transferred, the precision culture transferred, and something else transferred too. A pride in the work that would define Banner Lane for the next half-century. The first Ferguson TE20, TE for Tractor England, the most prosaic designation imaginable for what would become one of the most consequential machines in British history, rolled out of Banner Lane on the 6th of July 1946. It was grey, it was small, it weighed about 1,200 kilograms, and it was, by any measure, the finest tractor available to a British farmer. Early machines used an imported 1966 cubic centimetre Continental Z120 engine, a 4-cylinder American petrol unit that served while Standard's own engineers finished developing the 2088 cubic centimetre unit destined for the Standard Vanguard car. From September 1947, production switched to that Standard engine, a piece of parts bin engineering that gave Banner Lane a single engine line shared between cars and tractors, with all the economies of scale that implied. Ferguson's most famous marketing stunt belongs to this period. He had a TE20 driven into the ballroom of Claridge's Hotel during a cocktail party for foreign distributors. A farm tractor on the parquet floor of one of London's grandest hotels, surrounded by men in dinner jackets. It was the kind of thing that, in any other industry, would have been considered insane. In tractors, it sold export orders by the hundred. A diesel version appeared in 1951. Production climbed. At the height of TE20 production, over 6,000 people worked at Banner Lane, a workforce that had retrained from building 14-cylinder aero engines to building tractors with the same precision and pride. In 10 years, Banner Lane built 517,651 TE20s. The very last one came off the line in June 1956, photographed surrounded by jubilant standard fitters. For perspective, in 1939 there were still around 650,000 working horses on British farms. Heavy horses, Shires, Clydesdales, Suffolk Punches, that needed feeding whether they worked or not, that required a horseman's daily attention, that could plough perhaps an acre a day if the ground was kind. By 1958, there were fewer than 100,000. By the mid-1960s, the working horse had effectively vanished as an agricultural power source, the end of a 5,000-year-old way of life, visible, smelt, and heard on every farm in Britain. The stable door that had opened every morning at 5 now stayed shut. The harness that had hung on the same hook for 3 generations gathered dust. The heavy horse, the animal that had pulled the plough and the cart and the harrow since before the Romans came, was replaced by a small grey machine that cost less to run in a year than a horse cost to feed in 6 months. The little Grey Fergie didn't do that single-handedly. Fordson, David Brown and Nuffield all played their part, but no other single machine was as ubiquitous, as cheap, or as forgiving to small farmers who had never operated a piece of motorised equipment in their lives. A farmer who could barely afford 1 horse could afford a TE20, and the TE20, with Ferguson's 3-point linkage and hydraulic draft control, could plough 3 or 4 acres a day, not 1. It could mow, harrow, cultivate, and haul. It could do the work of a team of horses with a fraction of the running cost and none of the veterinary bills. For the small British farmer, the post-war smallholder with 40 or 60 or 100 acres, the TE20 wasn't a piece of equipment. It was an emancipation. The horse had fed Britain for millennia. The grey machine from Tile Hill replaced it in a decade. Chapter 4. The South Pole, the Half-Crown, and the Broken Man. The most extraordinary chapter in the TE20's life was written not in the mud of a Leicestershire farm, but on the ice of Antarctica. In 1956, the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition, under Sir Vivian Fuchs, set out to make the first overland crossing of Antarctica via the South Pole. Sir Edmund Hillary, the conqueror of Everest, by then the most famous New Zealander alive, led the Ross Sea Support Party. His job was to lay supply depots from Scott Base towards the pole. He needed vehicles. He chose Ferguson TE20s, 3 of them built at Banner Lane and modified by the Norwegian firm Eikmaskin. They fitted an extra wheel on each side, full caterpillar tracks that could be removed in lighter snow, heavy-duty starter motors and generators, silicon-coated wiring to resist the cold roll bars, and canvas cabins. The grey paint was stripped and replaced with bright red. Visibility against the snow mattered more than Harry Ferguson's corporate colour scheme. On the 14th of October 1957, the convoy left Scott Base. Over the next 82 days, they fought temperatures below -35 degrees, winds above 50 knots, and altitudes above 10,000 feet. They reached Depot 700 on the 15th of December 1957, and then Hillary made what became known as the Dash to the Pole, over the express objection of the Ross Sea Committee in Wellington, who wanted him to wait for Fuchs. Hillary ignored them. On the 4th of January 1958, Edmund Hillary, Murray Ellis, and Derek Wright arrived at the United States Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in 3 Coventry-built farm tractors. They were the first overland party to reach the pole since Scott in 1912, and the first ever to do so in motor vehicles. Hillary's telegram back to Coventry remains, 68 years later, the single greatest piece of unpaid product placement in the history of British engineering. Despite quite unsuitable conditions of soft snow and high altitudes, our Fergusons performed magnificently, and it was their extreme reliability that made our trip to the pole possible. Stop. Thank you for your good wishes. Hillary. A farm tractor. At the South Pole. Built in a shadow factory near Tile Hill. The story belongs to a different era. One where British engineering still believed it could go anywhere and do anything, and occasionally proved it right. One of those tractors, named Sue, sits today in the Massey Ferguson Technology Centre in Beauvais, France. That geographical detail will become significant later. But by 1952, back in the world of commerce rather than exploration, Harry Ferguson's empire had a problem. Demand for new tractors in North America had stalled. Harry Ferguson Inc., the American sales arm, was losing money. The TE20 was a triumph in Britain and across the Commonwealth, but the American market was different. Bigger farms, bigger machines, bigger competition from International Harvester, John Deere, and the Alice Chalmers empire. Ferguson needed a distribution network he didn't have. He needed capital he was burning through. He needed, whether his pride would admit it or not, a partner. In Toronto, James Samuel Duncan had precisely the opposite problem. Duncan was chairman of Massey Harris, Canada's oldest and largest farm equipment manufacturer, a company that had been building combines and reapers since before Confederation. Massey Harris had the dealer network. It had the global distribution. What it lacked was a modern small tractor design for the post-war market. Its own tractors were outdated. Ferguson's were the best in the world. Duncan came to England to discuss a tractor engine supply deal for Massey Harris's Kilmarnock combine harvesters and was invited to dine at Ferguson's home, Abbotswood, at Lower Swell, near Stow-on-the-Wold, in the Cotswolds. Over dinner, Ferguson stunned him. He didn't offer Duncan a supply deal. He offered him 50% of the whole company. The two parties negotiated to within $1 million of agreement. According to repeated accounts and the inscription on a silver cigar box later presented to Ferguson, they settled the final $1 million by tossing a half-crown coin supplied by Ferguson's financial advisor, John Turner, outside the Lygon Arms at Broadway, in the Cotswolds. Ferguson called tails. The coin landed heads. Ferguson lost $1 million. The deal was done. The merger was announced on the 17th of August, 1953. Massey Harris Ferguson Limited acquired Ferguson's operating companies in exchange for shares worth about $16 million. Ferguson took a board seat and was promised authority over design. Within months, he was in open conflict with his Canadian executives. They had no intention of giving an outside chairman a veto on engineering decisions. Ferguson's proposed price reduction system was ignored. The LTX, a larger TE20 successor he'd championed, was dropped. In April 1954, Ferguson offered his resignation. It became official on the 7th of July. Massey Harris bought his shares for around $15 million and inserted a 5-year non-compete clause to keep him out of the tractor business. He returned to Stow-on-the-Wold and poured himself into Ferguson research, which produced two remarkable things. The Ferguson P99 Formula One car, the only four-wheel drive F1 car ever to win a championship race, driven by Sterling Moss to victory at the 1961 Alton Park Gold Cup, and the Ferguson Formula 4-wheel drive system, later fitted to the Jensen FF Grand Tourer. The FF was, when it launched in 1966, the most advanced road car in the world. Four-wheel drive, anti-lock brakes, and a Chrysler V8, dressed in a body designed by Vignali. It was pure Ferguson, engineering perfection aimed at a market that wasn't quite ready for it. Even in exile from the tractor world, the man couldn't stop inventing. He couldn't stop being right either. Four-wheel drive would eventually become standard on half the cars sold in Britain. Ferguson had seen it 40 years early, but the darkness that had always been there was closing in. Those who worked with Ferguson described a man of furious focus and brittle ego, devastatingly charming and devastatingly rude in the same hour. Teetotal, almost obsessively self-disciplined, a Plymouth Brethren in his early life who carried the sect's intensity into everything he touched. He suffered for decades from chronic insomnia and recurrent depression. In 1953 and 1954, he underwent electroconvulsive shock treatment. In 1957, while on holiday in Jamaica, he was shot in the leg by a burglar, an incident his family said accelerated a long decline. On the 25th of October 1960, at Abbotswood, Harry Ferguson was found dead from an overdose of barbiturates. He was 75. The coroner's jury returned an open verdict. The inquest could not say whether the overdose was accidental or deliberate. The Irish Independent called him the Tractor King. He is commemorated on the Northern Ireland £20 note, in a bronze sculpture by John Sherlock in the Harry Ferguson Memorial Gardens at Dramara, in a blue plaque on the Ulster Bank building in Donegal Square, Belfast. The University of Ulster named its Harry Ferguson Engineering Village at Jordanstown after him. Harris was dropped from the corporate name in 1958. From then on, the world knew the company as Massey Ferguson, a brand built on an Irish inventor's name, a Canadian company's distribution network, and a Coventry shadow factory's production line. The first new red Massey Ferguson tractor was the MF35, introduced in 1957, powered by the four-cylinder Perkins 3A Bol 152 diesel, a machine that announced, in its red and grey livery, that the grey era was over and something bigger was coming. In 1959, Standard Motor Company sold all its tractor assets and the Banner Lane lease to Massey Ferguson, and Massey Ferguson acquired Perkins Diesel of Peterborough the same year. From that point, Banner Lane was a Massey Ferguson factory in fact as well as in name, and the old shadow factory on Banner Lane was about to grow into something its wartime builders could never have imagined. The founder was dead, the name was alive, and in Tile Hill, Coventry, the great factory was about to enter the most productive years of its existence. Chapter 5. The Red Giants. In the autumn of 1964, at the Smithfield Show in London, the annual gathering where British agriculture paraded its machinery, its livestock, and its ambitions, Massey Ferguson unveiled the machine that would define a generation of farming. The MF135 wasn't revolutionary in the way the TE20 had been. Harry Ferguson's three-point linkage and hydraulic draft control were already standard across the industry. Every major tractor manufacturer had adopted the principle under license or around it, because the alternative was to build obsolete machines. What the MF135 offered was something more prosaic and, in the long run, more powerful than revolution. It offered perfection of the ordinary. It was the machine that took everything Banner Lane had learned in 18 years of tractor production and refined it into something approaching the ideal small farm tractor. Affordable, reliable, powerful enough for most jobs, simple enough for a farmer to maintain himself. 45.5 horsepower from a Perkins AD3, 52, a three-cylinder, 2.5-litre diesel that was about as mechanically forgiving a power unit as any engineer had ever designed. 3 cylinders, not 4, fewer moving parts, less to go wrong. A farmer who could change a spark plug could maintain an AD 3.152 in a barn with a socket set and a Haynes manual. 6 forward gears and 2 reverse, later upgraded to 8 and 2 in dual range. A cab initially built by Dupel Coachworks of Blackpool, the same firm that built bus bodies and coach interiors, glass fibre on a steel frame, giving the driver a roof over his head for the first time on a small Massey Ferguson. When safety legislation tightened in 1970, the cab was upgraded to a steel rollover protection structure, a change that reflected a wider shift in how Britain treated its agricultural workers, from expendable to protected. The MF135 arrived at Smithfield alongside the MF165 and MF175 as part of the new Red Giants 100 series, the simultaneous launch of an entire range from entry-level to mid-market, all built at Banner Lane, all wearing the new livery of Massey Ferguson red and grey that would become as recognisable in the British countryside as a Land Rover or a sheepdog. Between 1965 and 1971, 322,428 MF135s rolled off the Coventry production line. Between 1971 and 1979, a further 90,725. Total MF135 production from Banner Lane, 413,153 tractors. The MF165 added many more. Combined MF100 series production, 1,098,025 units, the first British-built tractor range in history to pass 1 million. But numbers, however large, can't tell you what the factory felt like. For that, you'd have to walk through the gates. Imagine arriving at Banner Lane on a winter morning in 1968. The sky barely light, the air carrying the particular damp chill of a Coventry January. You'd come up from the Tile Hill estates, walking the same route as several thousand other men and women, past the terraced houses and the post-war semis, past the corner shop and the bus stop where the number 12 dropped off the workers who lived further out. You'd hear the works before you saw it, a low, persistent hum that seemed to come from the ground itself, as if the earth beneath Tile Hill were vibrating at some industrial frequency. Then you'd see the buildings, and you'd stop if it was your first day, because the scale of it was difficult to process. The main assembly hall ran for nearly a quarter of a mile, 1.8 million square feet of factory floor spread across the 80-acre site, nearly double the original wartime footprint, expanded and extended across the 1950s and 60s as production climbed. This wasn't a factory in the way that most people pictured a factory. This was a small industrial town under one roof. It had its own iron foundry, producing the molten metal for the engine blocks and transmission casings that formed the bones of every tractor. It had its own machine shop, a vast, precisely ordered space where rows of capstan lathes, gear hobbers and milling machines turned raw castings into finished components. It had its own paint facility, its own stores, its own tool room, its own test paddock. A man could spend 30 years at Banner Lane and never set foot in some departments because the place was simply too large for any one person to know all of it. Walking through the main entrance, the first thing that hit you wasn't sight, it was smell. Engine oil. The bass note, present everywhere, soaked into the concrete floor so deeply it would never come out. Then paraffin solvent, sharp and clean, used to degrease the components before assembly. Cellulose paint, the distinctive chemical sweetness of Stoneleigh red, the colour that several thousand bare gearboxes a week would receive in the paint shop before moving on down the line. Hot iron from the foundry, where furnaces ran at temperatures that made the surrounding air shimmer, and the foundrymen worked in conditions that hadn't fundamentally changed since the Victorian era. Intense heat, physical labour, the ancient craft of pouring liquid metal into sand moulds, and underneath it all, the faint, constant presence of cigarette smoke, because this was the 1960s, and everyone smoked, and nobody thought twice about it. 30 years later, retired workers would say that those smells, oil, solvent, paint, iron, tobacco, were the smells of their working lives, recalled in complete, involuntary detail at the most unexpected moments. The sound was a continuous roar, not deafening in any single source, but cumulative, layers of mechanical noise building on each other until the overall effect was a wall of sound you learned to work inside. Air wrench impacts, sharp and percussive, the rhythmic clang of the overhead chain conveyor carrying components from station to station, the whine of capstan lathes in the machine shop, where precision tools turned raw metal with the kind of tolerances that the wartime Hercules engine workforce would have recognized, the periodic hiss of pneumatics, the thump of presses, and voices, somewhere in the middle of it all, shouting over the din in Coventry accents, the flat vowels and swallowed consonants of the West Midlands working class, a way of speaking that carried its own geography and its own pride. The production line was a river. At one end, a bare chassis, a steel skeleton waiting to be given a purpose. It moved through the factory on the overhead conveyor and the floor track, picking up components at each station like a body acquiring organs. Axles fitted, gearbox mounted, engine lowered in and bolted down, the Perkins diesel arriving from Peterborough by lorry, uncrated and inspected, lifted by overhead hoist and settled into position with the particular care that came from knowing that if you got this wrong, someone in a field in Shropshire or Sri Lanka or Saskatchewan would pay for it. Hydraulics connected, electrical harness threaded through, steering column, seat, controls, all arriving from sub-assembly lines that ran parallel to the main flow like tributaries feeding a river. Each station had its team. Each team had its rhythm. The line moved at a pace that was brisk but not frantic, fast enough to be productive, slow enough to be careful. A tractor assembled in haste was a tractor that came back, and a tractor that came back was a failure that reflected on every man who'd touched it. At the far end, a complete tractor emerged, painted, tested on the dynamometer, driven to the test paddock where every single machine was put through its paces on real ground before being signed off for dispatch. The test drivers knew what a healthy machine sounded like, felt like, responded like, and they knew it the way a piano tuner knows a correct note, not from a manual, but from years of listening. Then the tractor was loaded onto flatbed lorries and rail wagons and driven to Coventry docks, or later, to the container port, bound for any of 140 countries across the world. The 16-storey tower block that fronted Banner Lane officially opened on the 21st of September 1966, providing office space for about 500 people, rose above the roofline of every building in the western half of Coventry. It was the landmark, the reference point, the thing you could see from miles away that told you where you were. Whenever we have new members, we tell them that if they get lost, they should just head for the tower. Terry Harvey, chairman of the Tile Hill North Residents Association and a member of the local running club, would later tell the Coventry Telegraph. The tower was ugly in the way that 1960s commercial architecture was often ugly. Raw concrete, functional, designed to house filing cabinets rather than inspire, but it was theirs. It announced that Banner Lane was not just a factory, it was a headquarters, a place where decisions were made, not just where things were built. Chapter 6. Massey Ferguson Families. The people who built those tractors were, overwhelmingly, from the streets within walking distance of the gates. Tile Hill and its surrounding estates, much of it post-war social housing, built in the great municipal construction drives of the late 1940s and 50s, were Massey Ferguson territory. The rhythm of the neighbourhood was the rhythm of the factory, the early shift arriving before dawn, the late shift leaving after dark, the day shift moving in the gap between. You knew what time it was by the flow of bodies on Banner Lane and Cromwell Lane and Red Lane, men in work boots and overalls, carrying lunchboxes and flasks, walking in groups that broke into the same conversations every morning. Last night's football, the weekend's racing, the gaffer's latest pronouncement, the state of the production target. The works hooter marked the hours the way a church bell marked them in an earlier age, and its absence, on weekends, on holidays, on the final day, would be one of the things people remembered most. The wages were good. Coventry was, by the late 1960s, one of the best-paid blue-collar cities in Britain, and Massey Ferguson was among the top payers even by Coventry's generous standards. The Coventry Telegraph called it a top payer for blue-collar workers. A skilled fitter or machinist at Banner Lane could earn enough to buy a house, run a car, take the family to Skegness or Tenby for a week in the summer, and put something aside. It was the kind of money that built lives, not fortunes, but lives. Stability. A second bedroom for the kids. A television in the front room. A decent Christmas. For working-class families in the West Midlands, these were not small things. They were everything. Multi-generational employment was the norm, not the exception. Fathers and sons worked the same lines. In some cases, grandfathers too. Men who'd joined Standard Motor Company during the war, retrained for tractors in 1946, and watched their grandsons clock in through the same gates 40 years later. Ted Everett, who would be recognised at the 2014 memorial unveiling as Massey Ferguson's longest-serving employee, embodied that continuity. A career measured not in job titles, but in decades of turning up, doing the work, and being part of something that mattered. The factory was the family business writ large. You didn't just work at Massey's, you belonged to Massey's. The distinction mattered. It meant something to the people who made it, and it showed in the way they talked about the place decades after it was gone. The apprenticeship system fed the factory its future. Young lads, and they were almost always lads in those years, came in at 15 or 16 and spent 4 years learning a trade under men who'd spent 30 years perfecting one. The apprenticeship was rigorous, practical, and conducted with the particular blend of encouragement and brutality that characterised British industrial training of the period. You learned by doing, you learned by watching, you learned by being told in no uncertain terms when you'd got it wrong. You learned to read a micrometer, to set up a lathe, to understand why a bearing ran hot, or a gear mesh whined. And at the end of it, you had a skill, a trade that was yours, portable, respected, the thing that made you a craftsman rather than a labourer. That distinction still mattered deeply in 1960s Coventry, a city where skilled men walked with a certain confidence, born of knowing that their hands could do something not everyone's could. Women worked at Banner Lane too, though the factory floor remained predominantly male throughout its life. Women had played crucial roles during the wartime Hercules production, as they had in shadow factories across the Midlands, and some remained after the transition to tractors. By the 1960s and 70s, women were concentrated in the lighter assembly work, in the stores, in the inspection departments, and in the offices of the tower block. Their contribution was real, if less visible in the photographic record, which tended to focus on the heavy machinery and the men who operated it. The unions were strong. Banner Lane was heavily organised by the Transport and General Workers Union, the Amalgamated Engineering Union, later the AEEU, and then Amicus from 1992, and the GMB. Shop stewards carried genuine authority on the floor. Industrial relations could be fractious. This was Coventry in the 1970s and 80s, and strikes were part of the industrial weather, as much a feature of the landscape as the canal and the ring road. But the relationship between management and workforce was, for most of the factory's life, a functional one. Both sides understood what the factory meant to the community it sustained, even when they disagreed about how the proceeds should be divided. The social infrastructure that grew around the factory was remarkable in its depth. The Massey Ferguson Sports and Social Club was built by the workers themselves, the sports facilities in 1956, the social club in 1968, funded not by the company, but by the workforce, out of their own weekly contributions. It stood on Broad Lane, Tile Hill, with a 250-seat function room, darts boards, snooker tables, karaoke nights on Saturdays, and televised football that packed the bar for every Coventry City match and every cup final. On a Saturday evening in the 1970s, the social club would be full. Workers and their wives, apprentices nursing their first legal pints, retirees who'd earned their place at the corner table, the community that the factory had created gathering in the institution the community had built for itself. The football team played in works leagues. The darts team competed against other factory clubs across the Midlands. It was a world within a world, sustained by the wages that came through the gates every Friday. The connections between the factory and the wider Coventry community ran deep. On the 9th of November 1984, a photograph taken inside the factory showed 5 Coventry City football legends: Lowell Harvey, Reg Matthews, Ernie Machine, Ronnie Farmer, and Brian Nichols, lined up beside a new tractor, all 5 of them by then working at Massey's. The sky blues and Banner Lane were woven from the same cloth. Working-class Coventry, the same terraced streets, the same accents, the same conviction that this city made things, and the people who made them mattered. On the 20th of May 1981, during the People's March for Jobs, the great walk from Liverpool to London that protested against the mass unemployment spreading across industrial Britain, Massey Ferguson workers joined colleagues from Rolls-Royce, Talbot and GEC in a sympathy stoppage that brought 4,000 marchers into the Coventry precinct. It was a moment that captured what Banner Lane was beyond a production facility, a political presence, a community institution, a place where collective identity was forged in the heat and noise and shared purpose of making something together. The workers who downed tools that day weren't just supporting strangers from Liverpool. They were defending a principle, that work mattered, that making things mattered, that the places where things were made deserved to be protected. David Walker, a former service department employee, wrote a memoir of his 21 years at the factory. Alan James of the Coventry production company Second Sight directed the 2010 DVD The Last Tractor, which captured testimony from many of the men and women who built the tractors. Massey Ferguson was the biggest and best of its kind in the world, James said. This stalwart of British manufacturing has sadly disappeared, but the achievements, the tractors, and the memories will live on. The memories, for those who carried them, were specific, not the grand sweep of production statistics, but the particular details of a working life. The bacon smell from the canteen at 6 in the morning, the way the overhead conveyor swayed when it was fully loaded, the weight of a gearbox settled into its housing, the moment, on a Friday afternoon, when the hooter sounded and the week was done and you walked out through the gates into the Tile Hill evening, knowing you'd be back on Monday, and that Monday was certain. Chapter 7. The Colour of British Farming. What Banner Lane meant beyond its own walls is difficult to overstate. It had become, by the late 1960s, something more than a factory. It was a symbol of British manufacturing capability, of agricultural modernity, of a country that still made things the world wanted to buy. Massey Ferguson red was, alongside Land Rover green, one of the 2 colours that defined British agriculture in the second half of the 20th century. Walk into any farmyard in England, Scotland, Wales or Ireland between 1960 and 1990, and the chances were better than even that you'd find a red tractor with the triple triangle badge on the bonnet. The MF135 was the machine that most British farmers of that generation learned to drive on. The first engine they started, the first clutch they let out, the first vehicle they reversed into a gatepost at 14 years old while their father shouted instructions from the yard. It was simple enough for a teenager to operate and tough enough to survive the experience. 3 qualities made the MF135 beloved, and farmers give the same 3 answers whenever they're asked. whether they're standing in a Somerset cattle market or a Kenyan agricultural cooperative. First, mechanical simplicity. A Perkins 3-cylinder diesel is about as forgiving a power unit as exists. You can do most repairs in a barn with hand tools, a socket set, and a basic understanding of how a compression ignition engine works. No electronics, no computers, no diagnostic equipment, just honest metal, honestly assembled. Second, reliability. 40 and 50-year-old MF135s remain in daily working use across Britain, Ireland, Sri Lanka, Kenya, and India. Machines that have outlived the factory that built them by decades, still starting on cold mornings, still pulling ploughs through heavy ground, still earning their keep in a way that their designers could barely have imagined. Third, residual value. A serviceable MF135 still changes hands for serious money all over the developing world. One Sri Lankan dealer was reported to be exporting more than 100 used Massey Ferguson tractors per year from the United Kingdom to Sri Lanka through the 1990s, buying them at agricultural auctions across the English shires and shipping them halfway round the world because they were still, 40 years after manufacture, the best small tractor a Sri Lankan rice farmer could buy. A Kenyan agricultural development worker described the MF135 as the machine that transforms a village. The difference, in parts of East Africa, between subsistence farming and feeding a community. That a machine built in a Coventry shadow factory could still be doing that work on a different continent half a century later. That was the measure of what Banner Lane produced. Banner Lane exported to over 140 countries. From the factory floor in Tile Hill, the red tractors went everywhere. To the prairies of Canada, to the tea plantations of Assam, to the sheep stations of New Zealand, to the arable farms of northern France, to the collective farms of the Middle East. Massey Ferguson red was the colour that ploughed the fields of 5 continents. Royal patronage was there too. Massey Fergusons worked at Sandringham and Balmoral, on Crown estates and tenant farms the length of Britain. The Triple Triangle badge carried a weight of association that no marketing campaign could have manufactured. It meant British, it meant dependable, it meant agricultural Britain at its most capable and most proud. By any honest reckoning, Massey Ferguson was a household name. One of those brands, alongside Rolls-Royce and Cadbury and the BBC, that people who had no connection to its industry recognised and respected. Children who had never been near a farm knew what a Massey Ferguson was. The red tractor was as much a part of the visual landscape of post-war Britain as the red telephone box and the red double-decker bus. It appeared on BBC farming programmes, in agricultural show photographs, in the background of 1,000 country scenes that defined how Britain imagined its own countryside. The phrase Massey Ferguson red was itself a colour, not quite scarlet, not quite crimson, but something specific and instantly recognisable. You saw it in farmyards, you saw it at the Royal Show, you saw it on the cover of Power Farming magazine and in the showroom windows of every agricultural dealer from Inverness to Penzance. It was the colour of British farming, and Banner Lane was where it all came from. Every MF135, every MF165, every MF100 series tractor that rolled into a British farmyard or onto a container ship bound for Mombasa or Colombo, every one of them started life in a shadow factory near Tile Hill, built by the sons and grandsons of the people who'd built Bristol Hercules engines to fight the Luftwaffe. Total Banner Lane tractor production across the entire life of the plant, from the first grey TE20 in 1946 to the last red machine in 2002, would reach 3,307,996 tractors. The last one would carry that number, 3,307,996, on its chassis plate like an epitaph. Banner Lane wasn't just Britain's largest tractor factory. It was, at its peak, the largest tractor factory in the Western Hemisphere. The name carried weight that extended far beyond agriculture. A faint image of one of the Antarctic TE20s appeared on the New Zealand $5 banknote. Harry Ferguson's face was on the Northern Ireland £20 note. The products of this single Coventry factory had reached the South Pole, the royal estates, the rice paddies of Asia, and the currency of 2 nations. No other British factory, not Longbridge, not Cowley, not Dagenham, could claim that kind of global reach from a single site. That was the Golden Age. And standing inside it, surrounded by the noise and the pride and the apparently unstoppable momentum of a factory that had built more than 1 million tractors of a single range, It would have been very difficult to believe that any of it was under threat. Chapter 8. The Long Survival. The threat, when it came, arrived not from the shop floor at Coventry, but from the boardrooms of Toronto. In 1977, the last good year, Massey Ferguson's chairman Albert A. Thornborough received a salary of $471,000, then the highest executive salary in Canada. Thornborough was a Kansas-born engineer who'd been brought to Toronto under Colonel W. Eric Phillips and had presided over Massey Ferguson's transformation into one of the world's first truly multinational corporations. The company was vast, global, confident. It made tractors, combines, diesel engines, and industrial equipment on 4 continents. Its brand was recognized in 140 countries. Then the bottom fell out. In 1978, Massey Ferguson lost $262 million, the largest corporate loss in Canadian history to that point. The late 1970s collapse in farm machinery demand, driven by falling commodity prices and rising interest rates, caught the company catastrophically overextended. Debt service consumed everything. Interest payments alone reached 20% of revenue by 1979. In the first 9 months of 1980, the company paid out $184 million in interest. The business that had put Harry Ferguson's name on 1 in 5 of the world's tractors was bleeding to death in a Toronto office tower. Into this catastrophe stepped the 2 most improbable figures in Canadian corporate history. First, Conrad Black, then 33 years old, newly in control of the Argus Corporation, holding company that dominated Massey Ferguson, who became active in the firm's management from the 16th of August 1978. Black, a man whose later life would make him one of the most controversial figures in the English-speaking press, tried to broker a rescue. On the 31st of October 1979, Volkswagen AG approached him with an informal offer for 51% of Massey Ferguson. Black rebuffed it. On the 23rd of May 1980, he resigned as chairman. In October, Argus simply donated its 16.4% stake, 3 million shares, then worth about $23 million, to the Massey Ferguson pension funds, and Argus's 7 directors retired from the board. Black's own words, in a UPI interview, were characteristically blunt. "I am violently opposed to any bailout of anything, but I think that this could be a good investment." Then came Victor Rice. Born on the 7th of March 1941 in Hitchin, Hertfordshire, the son of an English chimney sweep named Albert Edward Rice, Victor Rice had quit school at 16 and joined Ford Motor Company at Dagenham as a mailboy. From there he passed through Cummins Engines, Chrysler and Perkins Diesel at Peterborough, a Massey Ferguson subsidiary, where he rose to deputy managing director by 1975. He moved to Toronto as worldwide comptroller that same year and became president in 1978. In 1980, at 39, he became chairman and CEO, handed what the Wall Street Journal called one of Canada's worst corporate financial disasters. Rice fought through 3 restructurings between 1981 and 1986. He secured a $250 million bailout from the Canadian federal and Ontario provincial governments. He renamed the parent Verity Corporation in 1986. He moved the headquarters from Toronto to Buffalo, New York in 1991, eliminating Canada's last great farm machinery multinational. He closed the spun-off Massey Combines Corporation in 1988. He pivoted what was left toward automotive components, and through all of it, the debt restructurings, the government bailouts, the corporate renaming, the headquarters relocation, Banner Lane kept building tractors. The workforce shrank. The confident expansion of the 1960s was long gone, but the production lines ran. The Perkins diesels arrived from Peterborough, the red tractors rolled out of the test paddock and onto the lorries, and Coventry's tractor workers kept their jobs while the corporate empire above them was rebuilt, renamed, and redirected. In 1994, AGCO Corporation, an American farm equipment conglomerate that hadn't existed before 1990, completed its acquisition of Massey Ferguson worldwide from Verity for $300 million in cash and $18 million in stock. For Banner Lane, it looked like salvation. AGCO was a tractor company run by tractor people, with a strategy built around acquiring great brand names and expanding their reach. Massey Ferguson was the greatest brand name AGCO could have wanted. The acquisition brought over 1,000 additional dealers in North America alone, plus the worldwide distribution footprint that made Massey Ferguson one of the most valuable names in global agriculture. At the moment of acquisition, Massey Ferguson held about 20% of the global tractor market. For a few years, the future looked solid. Banner Lane was producing well, 28,000 tractors in 1996, rising to over 70,000 per year by 2000 when knockdown kit exports were included. The factory won internal AGCO manufacturing quality awards. It was, by every measurable standard, an efficient and well-run operation. The workforce was smaller than it had been, about 2,500 by the late 1990s, down from the peak of perhaps 8,000 in the late 1960s. But the work was there, the orders were strong, and the new American owners seemed committed. Then, on Friday the 4th of January 2002, something terrible happened. John Shumeda, AGCO's president and CEO, and Ed Swingle, the company's senior vice president of sales and marketing, were killed when their chartered executive jet, a Bombardier Challenger, registration N90AG, banked sharply and crashed seconds after takeoff from Birmingham International Airport at 7 minutes past 12. They were returning to the United States after a management meeting at Banner Lane. All 5 aboard died. The Air Accidents Investigation Branch would later conclude that the crew had failed to ensure the wings were clear of frost. The aircraft rolled 50 degrees to the left immediately after liftoff, despite full corrective input, and struck the ground in seconds. Shumeda was 54. Swingle was 59. They had been inside Banner Lane that morning. Bob Ratliff, AGCO's founder and executive chairman, immediately resumed the additional role of interim president and CEO. 5 months and 24 days later, he would fly to Birmingham again, not to visit the factory, but to announce its death. But before that Friday in late June 2002, there was a warning. In October 2000, Ratliff had said publicly that the factory's future would be in jeopardy if sterling remained strong against the euro. 85% of Banner Lane's output was exported, and the pound was climbing. The summit had been reached. The view from the top was magnificent, and the cliff edge was already underfoot. Chapter 9. The Gathering Storm. To understand how Banner Lane died, you have to understand the man who killed it. Not because he was a villain. He wasn't, not in any useful sense, but because the logic that destroyed a Coventry factory was the logic of a particular kind of American industrial mind, applied with absolute consistency to a situation that demanded it. Robert J. Ratliff was born in 1931 or 1932, his obituaries disagree, in Kansas. He joined the United States Air Force intending to become a pilot, completed a mechanical engineering degree instead, and spent 25 years at International Harvester, rising to president of its export group. He understood tractors. He understood global markets. He understood with a clarity that many of his competitors lacked that the farm equipment industry was consolidating, and that the winners would be the companies large enough to buy the losers. After a spell as president of Uniroyal Tire, he joined Deutz Alles in 1988. In June 1990, Ratliff and a small management team bought the North American holdings of Deutz Alles from the German conglomerate KHD, including Deutz Alles tractors and Allis Chalmers Gleaner combines, and renamed the company Allis Gleaner Corporation. AGCO. What followed was one of the most aggressive acquisition strategies in the history of American manufacturing. In 18 years, Ratliff drove 21 acquisitions and grew AGCO's net sales from $200 million in 1990 to nearly $5.5 billion by 2005. Heston in 1991. White Tractors the same year. North American distribution rights to Massey Ferguson in 1993. Worldwide Massey Ferguson in 1994. Fendt of Germany in 1997. Valtra of Finland in 2004, and a dozen others between. McConnell, Iokpe Maxion in Brazil, Deutz Argentina, Dronningborg in Denmark, Ag Chem, Sunflower Manufacturing, the Challenger tracked tractor business from Caterpillar. AGCO didn't invent farm equipment. AGCO bought the companies that had. For Banner Lane, this meant that the factory's fate was now in the hands of a man whose entire career was built on the principle that manufacturing capacity was a variable, not a commitment. Ratliff didn't think like Harry Ferguson, who saw his factory as an extension of his invention. He didn't think like Sir John Black, who saw Banner Lane as part of Coventry's industrial future. Ratliff thought like what he was, a financial engineer with deep product knowledge, a man who could calculate the cost of a factory to the last dollar and compare it without sentiment against the alternative. And the alternative was Beauvais. AGCO's Massey Ferguson factory at Beauvais, in the Picardy region of northern France, was the company's largest European facility. It built the bigger tractors, the models above Bannerlane's range. It had a skilled workforce, modern tooling, and something else that Bannerlane did not: political protection. French labour law made factory closures enormously expensive and procedurally difficult. French workers, supported by powerful unions and a government that regarded industrial employment as a matter of national prestige, would fight a closure with every legal, political, and industrial weapon available. The French government itself would intervene, publicly, loudly, and with the kind of sustained political pressure that American corporate boards found deeply uncomfortable. Britain offered no such protection. British labour law made redundancy relatively straightforward. British unions, weakened by 2 decades of legislation since the early 1980s, could fight but could not block. British politicians could condemn in the House of Commons, but they could not prevent a private company from closing a private factory. The asymmetry was brutal and obvious to everyone who understood it. Bannerlane was vulnerable for other reasons too. The factory produced tractors in the 50 to 116 horsepower range, the older, smaller end of the market, in a sector where farmers across Europe and North America were steadily trading up to bigger, more powerful machines. The product line was mature. The technology was proven, but not cutting edge. AGCO had not invested in moving Bannerlane upmarket, had not developed new models for the Coventry line, had not diversified the factory's output to reduce its dependence on the small tractor segment that was slowly shrinking. Whether that was deliberate, keeping Bannerlane on a product line that was declining, making closure easier to justify when the moment came, or simply the consequence of a corporation with too many factories and too little capital to invest in all of them, the effect was the same. Bannerlane was building yesterday's tractors. Beauvais was building tomorrow's, and 85% of Bannerlane's output was exported, principally to Eurozone markets, where British farmers' competitors bought their French-built tractors in euros, while Bannerlane's costs were denominated in pounds sterling. The pound was strong. Between 1996 and 2002, sterling sat persistently above its historical average against the euro and its predecessor currencies. For a factory that exported 85% of its production, every penny on the exchange rate was a direct hit to the margin. A tractor that cost a fixed amount to build in Coventry became steadily more expensive in every continental showroom, while an identical machine built in Beauvais held its price. Jake Vowles, Director General of the Agricultural Engineers Association, would later say what British manufacturing had been saying for years: "We have been telling governments since September 1997 that the pound is too strong for exporters, making us less competitive in markets around the world." Nobody in government listened. Or rather, people in government listened and did nothing, because the strong pound kept import prices low and inflation under control, and those were the metrics that mattered in the Treasury. The cost was borne elsewhere, in factory towns like Coventry, in industries like agricultural engineering, in places and sectors that didn't feature in the Chancellor's calculations. The strong pound was somebody else's problem. That somebody else was the workforce at Bannerlane. Bannerlane was not alone. The British tractor industry was collapsing around it. Ford ceased tractor production at its Basildon factory in 2002, the very same year. David Brown had been absorbed by Case in 1972, and the Meltham Works closed in 1988. Leyland's tractor factory at Bathgate in Scotland had shut in 1982. County Commercial Cars of Fleet in Hampshire, the builders of the mighty County 1184, the biggest four-wheel drive tractor in Britain, folded in 1983. International Harvester's factory at Doncaster had long since closed. Of the great post-war names in British tractor manufacturing, Ferguson, Ford, David Brown, Nuffield, International Harvester, Marshall of Gainsborough, County, Roadless, Muir Hill, almost nothing survived as a UK-headquartered tractor maker into the 21st century. Britain, which had once built everything from the family Fordson to the giant County 1184, was becoming a net importer of the machines that fed it. By 2002, Bannerlane was running at about 50% of its single-shift capacity. It was still producing tractors. It was still winning AGCO's own manufacturing quality awards. It was still technically efficient, A factory that had built over 3 million tractors knew how to build tractors. But the margins were thin, the currency was wrong, and across the Atlantic, in AGCO's headquarters in Duluth, Georgia, Bob Ratliff was doing the arithmetic. The arithmetic said, close Banner Lane, move tractor assembly to Beauvais, move the knocked-down kit business to AGCO's factory at Canoas in Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, save $20 to $25 million a year from 2004 onwards, spend $35 to $40 million on the relocation, pay the redundancy costs, accept the political noise, move on. Banner Lane was not the first AGCO factory to be closed, and the pattern was by now well established. The Coldwater, Ohio factory, which had built White and New Idea equipment, went in 1999. The Independence, Missouri Gleaner Combine Works closed in 2000. Its production transferred to Heston. Spracoop and Wilmar in Minnesota shut in 2001. In each case, the logic was the same. Consolidate manufacturing into fewer, larger facilities. Eliminate the costs of running multiple sites. Accept the human consequences as the price of efficiency. AGCO was not unusual in this. It was simply very good at it. The pattern told its own story. Beauvais and Marktoberdorf, both in continental Europe, both protected by stronger political and labour frameworks, were retained and expanded. The English-speaking, lightly regulated factories were closed. Coventry would absorb what France would not. Chapter 10. The Friday in June. On Friday the 28th of June 2002, 5 months and 24 days after the crash at Birmingham Airport that killed his president and CEO, Bob Ratliff flew back to Birmingham, not to visit the factory, to announce its death. The media briefing was held in the city, away from the factory gates and away from the workforce whose livelihoods were about to be ended by a man most of them had never met. Ratliff, now 70 or 71 years old, a man who'd built AGCO from nothing into the world's third largest farm equipment manufacturer, delivered the news with the measured clarity of someone who had made his calculation and was not going to be argued out of it. He had done this before. He would have known exactly how it would play. The announcement on a Friday, the oldest trick in corporate communications, giving the news cycle a weekend to cool before the working week began. The briefing away from the factory. No photographs of angry workers confronting the man who'd signed their redundancy notices. The precise financial language, costs, savings, margins, relocation budgets, that framed 1,000 human catastrophes as a balance sheet optimization. Banner Lane would close. Tractor assembly would transfer to Beauvais. The knocked-down kit operation, mostly the older MF200 series, would go to Canoas in Brazil. The main production line would shut at the end of 2002. Transaxle production would continue until mid-2003. Approximately 1,000 workers would lose their jobs. The numbers were precise because AGCO's numbers were always precise. Banner Lane covered 1.8 million square feet, the largest single facility AGCO owned anywhere in the world. The relocation would cost between $35 and $40 million. The annual savings from 2004 would be $20 to $25 million. The payback period was under 2 years. The factory had peaked at 28,000 tractors in 1996 and was now running at roughly half that. At current exchange rates, every tractor that left Banner Lane for a European dealer cost more to produce than the identical machine would have cost to produce at Beauvais. The investment case for closure was, by any conventional corporate metric, straightforward. In the language of AGCO's boardroom in Duluth, Georgia, it was a no-brainer. In the language of the people whose lives depended on the factory's survival, it was a death sentence delivered by someone who would never have to live with its consequences. The announcement fell on a Friday, for a reason. Friday announcements are the oldest trick in corporate communications. Give the news cycle a weekend to cool before the working week begins. Let the initial fury exhaust itself over Saturday and Sunday, when the newspapers are thin and the television bulletins are short. And by Monday, the story has already moved to page 5. Ratliff knew this. His communications people knew this. The timing was as calculated as the financial projections. But what AGCO did not say, what the press release did not contain, what Ratliff did not stand up at that Birmingham briefing and explain in plain language, was the real reason. Farmers Weekly, the industry's journal of record, stated it plainly in their contemporary reporting. Pressure from the French government and French workers made Beauvais the more difficult of the two to close. That was the calculation. Not that Banner Lane was failing. It had won AGCO quality awards. Not that its workers were inefficient. The factory was producing at higher per-unit productivity than it ever had. Not that the tractors coming off the line were anything less than world-class. The calculation was that closing Beauvais would provoke a political and industrial fight that AGCO did not want to have, a fight involving the French state, French unions, French courts, and French public opinion, whereas closing Banner Lane would provoke anger, headlines, a debate in the House of Commons, and a few weeks of bad press that would change nothing and cost nothing. They were right. It changed nothing. It cost nothing. Except a factory, 1,000 jobs, and what remained of Coventry's claim to be a city that made things. The reaction was immediate, vocal, and ultimately futile. Coventry South Labour MP Jim Cunningham tabled Early Day Motion 2023-2 in the House of Commons on the 8th of July 2002. The wording was blunt, that this House condemns the announcement by AGCO that they plan to close their factory based at Banner Lane in Coventry, notes with concern that the estimated 1,000 job losses at the plant itself could be overshadowed by the potential for job losses in feeder and subsidiary industries in the whole of the West Midlands, and calls upon the government to intervene and do all within its power to keep the factory open. 48 MPs signed it. John Austin, Labour, Erith and Thamesmead. Adrian Bailey, Labour Co-op, West Bromwich West. Robert N. Waring, Labour, Liverpool West Derby. 48 names on a piece of parliamentary paper that carried no legal force, no binding authority, and no practical consequence whatsoever. Geoffrey Robinson, Labour MP for Coventry North West, wrote separately to Industry Minister Alan Michael, linking Banner Lane to Coventry's wider industrial collapse. There is no room for complacency. Coventry has lost Jaguar, Massey Ferguson and Stadco, and faces severe reductions at Marconi. He pressed for a meeting with City MPs when Parliament returned in September. Bob Ainsworth, Labour MP for Coventry North East, was at that time a government whip and was constrained by the conventions of his position from publicly criticising the government's failure to intervene, a detail that captured, in miniature, the impotence of the political response. The man whose constituents were losing their jobs could not, without resigning his party position, publicly demand that his own government do something about it. Patricia Hewitt, then Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, the cabinet minister whose brief most directly encompassed manufacturing closures, made no documented intervention to prevent Banner Lane's closure, no emergency rescue package, no strategic intervention fund, no attempt to broker a deal that might keep production in Coventry. The political machinery of the United Kingdom absorbed the shock, expressed its sympathies, noted with concern, called upon the government, and moved on to the next item on the order paper. Chapter 11. The Fight That Couldn't Win. The workers didn't move on. They fought. They fought because they had no other option, and because the terms on which they were being thrown out of the factory they'd given their working lives to were, by any measure of fairness, an insult. Jerry O'Reilly, the Transport and General Workers Union's regional industrial organiser in Coventry, was the first point of contact for the workforce. O'Reilly was an experienced organiser. He knew the Coventry manufacturing landscape. He knew the history of factory closures in the West Midlands, and he knew, with the hard-won realism of a man who'd been through this before, that AGCO's decision was almost certainly final. The question was not whether the factory could be saved. The question was what the workers could extract from the company that was destroying their livelihoods. He told the Coventry Telegraph before the first round of negotiations, "We are determined our membership at AGCO will get the best possible deal." It was a careful statement. It promised nothing it could not deliver. Danny Carrigan, Amicus's national officer, organised the ballot. The result was overwhelming, 4-1 in favour of strike action. "Members have overwhelmingly voted to take strike action against the company," Carrigan announced. "AGCO came to us a week ago and made an offer of compensation and severance pay to the workers. The workforce have rejected that offer. They are particularly incensed that they will lose out on some of their pension entitlement because the factory is closing." That last sentence was the one that mattered. The fight wasn't principally about severance pay, though the initial offer was derisory. It was about pensions, and this was where the closure of Banner Lane turned from painful to cruel, from the ordinary industrial tragedy of a factory, closing to something that felt, to the workers living through it, like a deliberate robbery. Banner Lane was closing while the Massey Ferguson UK pension scheme was in deficit. The pension fund, into which workers had paid a portion of their wages every week for decades, on the promise that those contributions would fund a decent retirement, did not have enough assets to cover all the promises that had been made. Under the wind-up rules that applied when a defined benefit pension scheme was terminated with insufficient assets, the entitlements of active members, the people still working, still paying in, still expecting the retirement they'd been promised, were slashed, not reduced, not trimmed, slashed. The technicalities were complex, the actuarial calculations were arcane, but the human consequences were simple and devastating. Peter Booth, the Transport and General's National Organiser for Manufacturing, put numbers on it. This is an astonishing ruling which appears to go against the spirit and letter of pension fund rules, he said. A production worker aged 55 will now see 60% of their pension entitlement wiped out by this ruling. 60%. Think about what that means for one specific person, a man aged 55. He started at Banner Lane at 18 or 19, straight from one of the Tile Hill estates, because his father worked there and his father's father worked there, and it was what you did. He served his apprenticeship. He learned a trade. He spent 35 years on the production line, building gearboxes, fitting engines, testing finished tractors on the paddock, doing the work day after day for 3.5 decades. He paid into his pension every week. He planned his retirement around the promise that pension represented, the modest but sufficient income that would see him and his wife through old age. And now, because the American corporation that owned his factory had decided it was cheaper to build tractors in France, 60% of that promise had evaporated. Not because the pension fund had been raided, not because the company had gone bankrupt, but because the rules said that when a pension scheme wound up in deficit, the active members, the people who were still working and had the least power to protect themselves, took the biggest losses. The union took legal advice. The case worked its way through the courts. The Court of Appeal ultimately upheld the ruling. The law was the law. The workers' pensions were cut. The pension catastrophe at Banner Lane became, in the years that followed, one of the early data points used by trade unions in the campaign that eventually produced the Pension Protection Fund in 2005. A safety net designed to catch exactly this kind of catastrophe, to ensure that workers whose factories closed beneath them did not lose the retirements they had spent decades paying for. The campaign took years. It required political will that had been conspicuously absent when Banner Lane needed it. But it succeeded, eventually, because enough examples like Banner Lane accumulated to make the injustice impossible to ignore. The Pension Protection Fund now covers millions of workers across Britain. It exists because of cases like this one, because men and women in Coventry and Sunderland and Sheffield and a dozen other factory towns lost their pensions when their factories closed, and eventually someone in Parliament decided that was not acceptable. But the Pension Protection Fund came too late for the men and women of Banner Lane. Their pensions were cut before the safety net existed. They were the proof that the safety net was needed. The people who benefited from the reform were not the people who paid for the lesson. Aguillo's initial severance offer was rejected. Negotiations ground on through the autumn of 2002. The strike ballot gave the unions leverage, but leverage against a company that has already decided to close is leverage applied to a wall. You can push all you want, but the wall is not going to move. The terms improved, modestly. They did not transform. The workers who had spent their careers building tractors for a company that was now discarding them accepted, in the end, what they could get. There was no alternative. The factory was closing. The decision had been made in Georgia, confirmed in Birmingham, and ratified by the silence of Westminster. All that remained was the dying. Through it all, the production lines kept running. There were tractors to finish, orders to fulfill, contracts that had been signed before the closure announcement and had to be honoured. The workers who had voted 4-1 for strike action went back to the line every morning and built tractors, precisely, carefully, with the same craft they'd always brought to the work. The quality didn't drop. The pride didn't vanish. Whatever anger they carried through the gates stayed off the production floor. They were Massey Ferguson workers, and Massey Ferguson workers built tractors properly, even when the machines they were building were the last ones that would ever carry the name out of Coventry. That, more than anything else in this story, tells you who these people were. Chapter 12. Christmas Eve. The last months of Banner Lane had a quality that everyone who was there describes in similar terms. It was like watching someone you loved grow ill. You knew the ending, you went through the motions of normality. And the normality, the familiar routine, the same commute, the same overalls, the same sounds and smells, made it worse, because it reminded you, every hour of every shift, of what you were about to lose. Through the autumn of 2002, the workforce shrank. Redundancies came in waves, not one sudden mass departure, but a slow bleeding away. A few dozen here, a few dozen there, men collecting their cards and shaking hands with the men they'd worked alongside for years or decades. The car park that had once held thousands of vehicles grew emptier, week by week. Lines that had run at full capacity went quiet. Departments that had hummed with activity fell silent one by one, like rooms in a house being closed off for winter. Some went quietly, some didn't. The anger was real, and it was directed not at the foremen or the line managers, who were losing their jobs too, but at the boardrooms in Georgia and the offices in Westminster that had conspired, by action and inaction, to make this happen. There were men who had given 30 years to that factory, men who had trained apprentices, men whose idea of a career had never involved a redundancy payment and a drive to the job centre. For them, the closure wasn't just the loss of a job, it was the end of a world. The world in which you clocked in, did the work, collected your wages, and knew that Monday would come again. That certainty, the simple, profound certainty of having a place to go and a purpose when you got there, was what AGCO had taken from them, and no severance package could replace it. The production target for the final quarter was clear. Build the last tractors. Clear the order book. Do the work right, because the name on the bonnet was still Massey Ferguson, and Massey Ferguson meant something, and the fact that the Americans had decided it didn't mean enough to keep the factory open didn't change what it meant to the people who built the machines. December came. The days shortened. The Tile Hill estates grew dark by 4 o'clock. The Christmas decorations went up in the canteen and in the offices of the tower block, a surreal touch of normality in a building that everyone knew was counting down its final days. The overhead conveyor still clanged. The air wrenches still fired. The Perkins diesels still arrived from Peterborough by lorry and were still lowered into position with the same precision as always. The foundry still poured. The paint shop still sprayed Massey Ferguson red onto gearbox casings that would be shipped to Beauvais, the factory that had survived because France wouldn't let it die. On the morning of the 24th of December 2002, the last Massey Ferguson tractor built at Banner Lane entered the final stations of the production line, chassis number 3, 307 996. Alan James of Second Sight had his cameras there. The footage he shot that day, later incorporated into the 2010 DVD The Last Tractor, is the most powerful surviving record of what was lost. Men and women in oil-stained overalls, standing in the great shed that had built more than 3 million tractors, watching a single red and grey machine move through the final stations of a production line that had been running, in one form or another, since the 6th of July 1946. 56 years. Some of them had been there for decades. Some were third-generation Massey Ferguson employees, grandchildren of the Standard Motor Company fitters who'd built Bristol Hercules engines in the same building during the war. They stood and watched. They watched the tractor pass through the final inspection. They watched it driven off the line and out of the great shed. Then the line stopped. The motors wound down. The conveyor went still. The sound that followed wasn't silence, exactly. A factory that has been producing for more than half a century has a particular acoustic presence, not just the machinery, but the ventilation systems, the compressed air, the low-level electrical hum, the movement of people through spaces designed for movement. When that stops, what you notice first isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of a kind of silence that shouldn't be there. A silence in the wrong shape. A silence that has the dimensions of the building it fills. 1/4 of a mile long, 100 feet high, and absolutely, completely still. The factory continued limited operations into 2003. Partially built tractors were completed. Transaxles and gearboxes were produced for shipment to Beauvais. Components made in Coventry, bolted into tractors that would carry the Massey Ferguson name, but would never carry the Banner Lane workers' fingerprints again. Final shutdown was the 25th of July 2003. Approximately 1,000 jobs were lost outright at Banner Lane. Some reports say 1,200, or 1,300. About 300 workers were retained for the wind down, the skeleton crew that kept the lights on while the last gearboxes were crated and shipped, and the great building was prepared for the demolition crews. The UK Massey Ferguson parts business at Desford in Leicestershire was unaffected, but the feeder industries and supply chain firms across the West Midlands felt the impact. Jim Cunningham's early day motion had warned of exactly this, that the 1,000 headline job losses would be overshadowed by the potential for job losses in feeder and subsidiary industries in the whole of the West Midlands. The warning was accurate. The true toll, counting the suppliers and subcontractors and hauliers and service businesses that depended on Banner Lane's wages and Banner Lane's orders, was much larger than the headline figure. 1,000 men and women walked out of those gates for the last time. Into what? Some retrained. Some found work in what remained of Coventry's shrinking manufacturing sector. At Jaguar, for those who could get in, though Jaguar's own future at Browns Lane was far from secure, at the smaller engineering firms that still operated in the West Midlands. Some took jobs in the service economy, security, retail, delivery driving, call centres, at wages that bore no resemblance to what a skilled machinist had earned at Massey's. The skills that had been learned over decades, the precision and the craft and the understanding of how metal worked and how engines breathed, were suddenly worth nothing in a local economy that wanted call handlers and warehouse operatives. Some, the older ones especially, never found equivalent work again. A 55-year-old fitter with 30 years of tractor experience, a pension that had been cut by 60%, and a redundancy payment that wouldn't last the year did not have an easy path into the economy of 2003. The retraining programs existed. The government pointed to them. But retraining a 55-year-old machinist as an IT technician or a care worker was not the same as giving him back what he'd lost. Not just the income, but the identity, the status, the sense of being someone whose hands could do something that mattered. The skills were real. The experience was deep. The market for both, in a city that had been losing factories for 30 years, was vanishingly small. What AGCO had taken from Coventry wasn't just a factory. It was the last major piece of the city's manufacturing identity, the last place where thousands of people went to work every day and made something physical, something you could touch and drive and export to 140 countries. After Banner Lane, Coventry's claim to be a city that made things was, for the first time in its modern history, essentially hollow. Chapter 13. Bannerbrook Park. After the workers left, the demolition began. Decommissioning the Banner Lane site was itself a major industrial operation. Decades of heavy manufacturing had left their mark in the ground, as well as in the buildings. Heavy metals, hydrocarbons, oil residues and methane had to be excavated. Underground fuel and oil storage tanks, concentrated in the northern portion of the site, were dug out and removed. The concrete floors that had borne the weight of 3 million tractors were broken up and carted away. The great wartime shadow factory shed, the original million-square-foot building that the Air Ministry had paid £1.7 million to construct in 1939, was demolished between 2003 and 2005. A building that had produced 20,000 Bristol Hercules engines and more than 3 million tractors was reduced to rubble and loaded into skips. The 16-storey tower block survived longer than the factory it had served. AGCO Europe vacated it in 2006, moving its European, Africa and Middle East headquarters 8 miles east to Abbey Park, at Stoneleigh in Warwickshire. The tower stood empty for 6 years, a concrete monolith on the skyline of Western Coventry, marketed unsuccessfully as office space, a building that nobody wanted but nobody could ignore. It was visible from the M6, from the Tile Hill estates, from the running routes of the local athletics club, whose members had once used it as a navigation point. For 6 years it stood there, empty, a monument to nothing except the fact that demolishing a 16-storey building costs money and takes time. On the 8th of July 2012, at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, the tower was brought down by controlled explosion. Hundreds gathered to watch, former workers, Tile Hill residents, families who had lived in the shadow of the building for decades. Regional television carried it live. The charges fired, the concrete buckled. 16 stories of offices, meeting rooms, filing cabinets, and dead fluorescent lights folded in on themselves and collapsed into a cloud of grey dust that rose above Tile Hill and drifted east across Coventry. It took 8 seconds. Richard Markwell, then Massey Ferguson Vice President and Managing Director for Europe, Africa and Middle East, said on the AGCO corporate blog, "The Banner Lane tractor manufacturing plant, which closed in 2003 and 16-story office block at Coventry in the UK, which we vacated in 2006, were very much part of the history of AGCO's Massey Ferguson brand and its successful development over more than 6 decades. We can look back at the Banner Lane site with great respect and lasting memories of the role it played in our rich heritage and evolution. It is part of our DNA. DNA, the company that closed the factory called it DNA. The company that chose Beauvais over Coventry, because France was harder to close, called the thing it had destroyed part of its genetic identity. In October 2005, Coventry City Council granted outline planning permission for mixed-use redevelopment by Persimmon Homes South Midlands, up to 650 dwellings initially, later expanded to about 1,000 homes on the 97-acre site. The resulting estate is called Bannerbrook Park. It has a primary school, a local centre with shops, sports pitches, pavements where the assembly line used to be, cul-de-sacs where the machine shop stood, gardens where the iron foundry poured molten metal into moulds for more than 50 years. On the 6th of July 2014, chosen to mark the 68th anniversary of the first TE20 rolling off the line, a 2.1-metre bronze and granite memorial plaque was unveiled at Bannerbrook Park. The sculptor was Gemma Pearson. The bas-relief depicts the first and last tractors built at Banner Lane and a portrait of Harry Ferguson. The unveiling was performed by the Lord Mayor of Coventry, Councillor Hazel Noonan, by Richard Markwell of Massey Ferguson, by Andy Peters of Persimmon Homes, South Midlands, and by Ted Everett, Massey Ferguson's longest-serving employee. Roads on the estate carry tractor-related names: Centaura Walk, Delta Close, Ferguson Close, and a bridle path is called Massey Ferguson Way. A second commemorative bench, designed by a student named Matthew Dill, was added later. The Massey Ferguson Sports and Social Club still stands on Broad Lane. It is the only physical institution of Banner Lane that survived the demolition essentially intact, rebuilt onto the new estate under the AGCO and Persimmon redevelopment agreement. The function room still holds 250. There are still darts boards, snooker tables and televised football. On some evenings, former Banner Lane workers drink there. Fewer every year, of course. Time does what the demolition crews did, only slower. Banner Lane's closure was the latest blow in a half-century pattern of Coventry deindustrialisation that had already taken the Standard Triumph works at Canley, the Roots and Chrysler and Peugeot factory at Ryton, the Jaguar works at Browns Lane, Alvis, Armstrong Siddeley, and a long roll call of smaller component firms. Ford ceased tractor production at Basildon in 2002, the same year as Banner Lane. David Brown had been absorbed by Case in 1972 and the Meltham factory closed in 1988. Leyland's tractor works at Bathgate shut in 1982. County Commercial Cars folded in 1983. Britain, which had once built everything from the family Fordson to the giant County 1184, became a net importer of agricultural machinery. The industry that had replaced the horse was itself replaced, not by a new technology, but by a new geography. The tractors were still made. They were just made somewhere else. The artist George Shaw, shortlisted for the Turner Prize in 2011, grew up in Tile Hill. His paintings of the estates and their pubs and lock-up garages and empty playing fields became one of the iconic visual records of late 20th century English suburban decline. Shaw painted what was left after the work had gone, the particular melancholy of places that had been built for a purpose and had outlived it. Chapter 14. What the Silence Keeps. Massey Ferguson tractors are still made. They come off the line at Beauvais, the largest AGCO factory in Europe, the factory that survived because France would not let it die. They are built at Canoas in Brazil, at Marktoberdorf in Germany under the Fendt badge, at Jackson and Heston in the United States, and at facilities in Italy, Mexico, India, Pakistan, Japan, and China. The triple triangle badge still appears on red machines in farmyards across the world. The brand lives. The name lives. What doesn't live is the place that made it. The Coventry Transport Museum holds 2 tractors from Banner Lane. One is the 500,000th machine. The other is the very last, chassis number 307,9996. The tractor that rolled off the line on Christmas Eve 2002 while Alan James's cameras recorded the faces of the people who built it. At the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum at Coventry, outside Belfast, you can see the prototype black tractor that Harry Ferguson built in 1933 and a replica of the monoplane he flew at Hillsborough in 1909. In Beauvais, at the Massey Ferguson Technology Centre, a small grey tractor named Sue sits in a display area, one of the 3 TE20s that Edmund Hillary drove to the South Pole in 1958. A machine built at Banner Lane, preserved in the factory that replaced Banner Lane. The irony is not subtle. Harry Ferguson died of a barbiturate overdose at Abbotswood in 1960, aged 75. The coroner returned an open verdict. Bob Ratliff died at his home in Johns Creek, Georgia, in April 2017, aged 85. Victor Rice died in Buffalo in June 2022. The 3 men whose decisions shaped Banner Lane's arc, the inventor who created it, the corporate surgeon who saved it, and the acquisitor who destroyed it, are all gone. The factory is gone. The tower is gone. The great wartime shed, where 20,000 Hercules engines and 3 million tractors were built, is gone. What remains is a housing estate in Toil Hill. A bronze plaque depicting the first and last tractors, unveiled on the anniversary of the day it all began. A social club where fewer men gather every year. A bridle path called Massey Ferguson Way, where young mothers push prams along a route that once carried finished tractors to the loading bay. And in farmyards across 6 continents, red machines that still start on cold mornings, still pull ploughs through heavy ground, still do the work they were built to do, quietly, reliably, without complaint. Some of them are 60 years old. Some are older than the people who drive them. They will outlast everything except the memory of where they came from, and even that is fading now, because the men and women who built them are growing old. And one day, the last Banner Lane worker will die, and the living memory will pass into history, and there will be nothing left but the machines themselves, still running, still working, still earning their keep in fields the people of Toil Hill will never see. 3,307,996 tractors, built by the people of Toil Hill in a shadow factory that was never meant for tractors, on a lane that carries a Civil War name. The factory replaced the horse, and then the factory was replaced by houses. The silence at Bannerbrook Park is very deep. It is the silence of a place built for noise, for the roar of capstan lathes and the clang of the overhead conveyor and the hiss of pneumatics and the voices of several thousand people doing the work of their lives. That silence is there now, underneath the school playground and the garden fences and the double-glazed windows of 1,000 Persimmon homes. The people who live there may never hear it. But it's there. It sits in the ground the way the engine oil soaked into the factory floor, too deep to remove, too quiet to notice, too permanent to forget.